Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Spillman. I'm the editor of Tin House, and I'm introducing the Revolutionary Literature Conversation. A few housekeeping things I've been asked to pass on. Turn off your cell phones, or at least mute them, please. The authors will be happy to sign books and talk afterwards, but please, please, please let them escape first. Let them go out there. They will be doing the signing out there. So if you could hold your questions for them until they're out there. It is an extremely exciting time in the Middle East, as everybody knows. Revolution is in the air, and there are great possibilities and, of course, dangers. Middle Eastern writers are integral to the current agitations that make today's discussion up here extremely timely and relevant. And I personally can think of few others I would like to hear discuss this topic than Daniyal Mueenuddin and Reza Aslan. Daniyal Mueenuddin, his linked story collection, In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, chronicles a rich and powerful Pakistani family and its many employees. And it casts light on day-to-day power struggles not usually seen in today's media. The collection deservedly won the Story and Commonwealth Prizes and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He will be speaking today with Reza Aslan, the author of the best-selling No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam. Also, Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in a Globalized Age. That's the paperback version. He's also the editor of the anthology Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East, and co-editor of Muslims and Jews in America, Commonalities, Contentions, and Complexities. No God But God was translated into 13 languages and has become a touchstone book for scholars, politicians, and intellectuals around the world. If you wish to begin to understand what is happening in the Middle East, both Aslan and Mueenuddin's books are required reading, and if you guys have not bought them yet, you really should after the reading. So please welcome Reza Aslan and Daniyal Mueenuddin.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniyal. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to start, since this is a literary festival after all, by reading a poem. This is called I Am the People by the great septuagenarian Egyptian poet Ahmed Fuad al-Nigam. I am the people marching, and I know my way. My struggle is my weapon, my determination my friend. I fight the nights, and with my hope's eyes I determine where true morning lies. I am the people marching, and I know my way. I am the people. My hand lights life, makes deserts green, devastates tyrants, raising truths, banners on guns. My history becomes my lighthouse and comrade. I am the people marching, and I know my way. No matter how many prisons they build, no matter how much their dogs try to betray, my day will break and my fire will destroy seas of dogs and prisons out of my way. I am the people, and the sun is a rose in my sleeve. The day's fire, horses galloping in my blood. My children will defeat every oppressor. Who can stand in my way? I am the people marching, and I know my way. This poem was written 50 years ago in defiance of the Nasser regime. And a few months ago, Nigam, who is about 78 years old, was able to stand in Tahrir Square and recognize that the promise that he made about his children, who will defeat every oppressor, has become true. One of the things that I'm really fascinated by, and this is part of what Tablet and Pen is about in this discussion, is that the untold story that literature has played, particularly in the broad countries of North Africa and the Middle East, in shaping society, in bringing down tyrants. In Tunisia, of course, those tens of thousands of kids who brought down the dictator Ali were chanting protest chants that were actually verses of poetry from the great Tunisian poet Abu Qassam al-Shabi. In Egypt, it was An-Nigam. In Iran, you had the poems of Reza Barahani, whose poetry was about the dictatorship of the Shah, but which was used sort of reused or recycled to emphasize the dictatorship of the current regime. And of course in Libya, where poetry is also playing a role in creating this sort of vibrant sense of revolution, it's something that I think we've kind of lost track of here in the US. And that kind of makes sense, because if you live in a country in which freedom of speech, freedom of the press is severely curtailed, the poet, the writer, becomes the journalist. He or she becomes the historian, the social critic. Poetry becomes the mirror that's held up to society to show its weaknesses and its failures. And it's for that reason why poetry in large parts of the Middle East is seen as the dangerous element that it truly is, and why so many of the poets that I've collected were imprisoned, were tortured, were executed. And it brings up this sort of larger issue that we wanted to discuss about the role of politics in literature, not just in the Middle East, but even here. Because while I actually think that literature, and particularly in places like the Middle East, is inherently a political act. Writing is inherently a political act. When a verse of poetry can get you executed, it's by definition a political act. I think Daniyal disagrees with that notion and believes that perhaps the line between politics and literature should not be so fluid.
You're not allowed to characterize for me now.
Well, I'm just, we had a discussion about this already, as you can imagine.
We discussed this last night and agreed that there would be no biting, kicking, or punching, but that we do have...
Agreed.
Yeah, it was late when that was done. But we roughly agreed that we certainly understand or understood that we have radically different positions on this. My view is that is with W.H. Auden, who famously said, poetry makes nothing happen, and also equally famously said that the unacknowledged legislators of the world are not the poets, but the secret police. My view is, I'd like to talk about it in two parts. The first part is the relationship that the writer has with his writing, and in that I believe that as soon as any political intention enters into his effort, the work is lessened. The job of the writer is not to take sides with any of his characters. I believe that the job of the writer is rather, Chekhov says that what we do is we do not condemn our characters, but rather once they've been condemned and found guilty and sentenced, that our job is to empathize with their predicament. And I think that certainly in my writing is critical. That I have to, no matter how good or bad a character may be, I have to inhabit his world or her world and look at the world from his or her perspective, and to entirely embrace that perspective, and to understand that whatever that person may be or have done, his circumstances have made him be or do that. However, I think, to turn it back over to you, I think that one can argue that although the intention of the author may be entirely apolitical, that the effect of the work may be very political. So with that, I would turn it over to you.
I think that's a really good point, and brings up these larger issues about the control that the author has over his or her work. I think that Auden is right. Poetry doesn't change anything in England.
Fiction does.
Yeah, fiction. In England, nothing. I mean, one can say perhaps in the United States that if we go back to the 50s and 60s and we talk about the beat poets and that entire generation that really did reframe the way that Americans saw themselves and the way they saw their countries, we can talk about that effect here in the United States. But even here, it's still, an idea of literature as aesthetics that I think makes much more sense than in a place like Egypt or in a place like Iran, where poetry does have the power to reshape societies. As a matter of fact, one of the things that's really fascinating about the 20th century and the literature of this region is that it actually was the writers, it was the poets who first gave shape to the very notion of a modern Arab identity, or a modern Turkish identity, a modern Persian identity. The idea of Pakistan was as much a creation of poets and writers like Muhammad Iqbal and Faiz Ahmed Faiz, as it was of, you know, Jinnah and Maududi.
But isn't it, I mean, to try to slice it more finely, isn't it, wouldn't it be better to say that there's a sort of a popular, or, you know, that there's a social sort of Weltanschauung, you know, that there's a unnamed impulse within the society, which then the writers give a name to, and that they're not the creators of this movement, but rather the namers of it. And of course that helps, because naming is a very powerful act, and once the thing is named, it's possible for, you know, people coalesce around that name, and it gives it a fixed identity. But that it's not that the poets or the writers are creating this thing, but rather that they're following behind.
I think that's a very good point. I would say that, talking about sort of the beginning of the 20th century, 1910, 13, 14, around then, when the very concept of the modern Middle East was coming to fruition, there was really no such thing as a kind of an Arab national identity because of the Ottoman dominance, because of European colonial dominance. So the first step to creating that identity involved language. I mean, what's the firmest way to create a collective identity? Well, if we all speak the same language, you know, that's what binds us as one. And it was the poets and the writers who, in the Arab world, stripped Arabic of its Ottoman influences, met in these secret societies where they really revived the Arabic language. In Turkey, where they stripped Turkish of its Persian and Arabic influences and created a new modern Turkish language. Even in Iran, Urdu, which became the national language of Pakistan, was in many ways sort of the language of the poets and writers. So, I mean, I think you're right that there is this sort of issue that has to be addressed about almost a chicken and egg kind of question. And yet, I think that when dealing with this particular region of the world, which doesn't really share much in common with each other in terms of language, in terms of religion or culture or ethnicity or nationality, but which does share this sort of common historical narrative, this common shared experience of having to create a unique national identity, in some cases out of thin air. In those kinds of circumstances, yes, the political class is helpful because they create, you know, the drive, but it's the poets and writers who create the symbols of that identity. It's their metaphors that give shape to these vague notions of national identity.
I guess that's right. I think the other thing you could say is that all description is political, in the sense that if it's done well, it correctly identifies the nature of the society, and therefore, if, you know, as you know, these regimes, for example, in the modern Middle East, where you have all these autocratic regimes, simply by describing them, and by therefore in the minds of people, of the average person in the street who hasn't really articulated for himself what is the situation in which he's living, that this is correctly identified.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about Pakistan, because this is a very interesting case study, as I was saying, about, you know, the role that you know, these great poets like you know, Faiz Ahmed Faiz and Muhammad Iqbal played in creating sort of the zeitgeist around which the notion of a national home for you know, a Muslim body politic could be created. I'm curious, you know, because you live in the Punjab, like, what is there still a role for these great national poets? I mean, do people even think about them when they think about sort of the fathers of the country?
The problem is that, first of all, most of the people can't read, and therefore literature just doesn't play a role in their lives. One. Two, the status of writers, I mean, because there are these regional writers and who are, you know, among a very small group of sort of aficionados. These guys are you know, they have mushadas where they read this stuff and so on. But the status of the writer is very low in Pakistan. I mean, it's sort of almost like in the Renaissance, or you know, in Europe at certain times, where the sort of the you know, the artists ate with the servants and came in through the back door. And it's that sort of mentality that is still that's still the way in which artists are regarded. So Iqbal, for example, is probably important because he's sort of force-fed to the school children, the ones who do go to school. But in general, I don't think that literature is playing a big role in defining the politics in Pakistan.
It's funny because I could say the exact opposite about Iran. Iran, obviously, you know, it's an authoritarian country. It's a fractured country. It's a country in which there is really an open war taking place between the people, some 70% of whom are under the age of 30, and the elite, the political and religious elite. And that war isn't so much about politics. It's not so much about you know, freedom and democracy, as it is a war over the meaning of the state, the symbols of the state. And although it's true that, you know, the Iranian regime has been quite brutal to, you know, political statements, to the reform movement, the green movement, it has currently the second largest number of journalists in prison, just a few less than China. Of course, China has 1 billion people. So, you know, it could very easily be called the worst place in the world for journalists right now. They pay a special attention to poets, to writers, who they feel have an ability to get past the censors, to get past the restrictions of society, and to speak to people at their level in a coded language.
Right.
You know, in a language that the government can't control, and they are deathly afraid of that, which is why so many of the prisons in Iran are filled with writers.
I guess the other thing would be that, yes, it's true that most Pakistanis are illiterate, but the people who are actually, you know, making things happen, you know, is this sort of an intellectual elite in the cities, and those guys, you know, are aware of poetry, or have, you know, some of them at least. But in Pakistan, I think one of the things is that the government, the people who run the place, are completely illiterate themselves. I mean, Zardari can barely read or write, I believe. So
we know he can't add.
Exactly. No, I think math is his strong point. He counts
10%, they
exactly
added
the
10%
10% each time. But so, I mean, it's just not part of the discourse. But yes, you know, I mean, the guys who are determining it, to the extent that it's being done by intellectuals, is the journalists.
Well, I'm curious. We're going to open this up to a discussion here. But the thing that I'm very interested in is to see now, as we are seeing this dramatic change taking place in North Africa, in the Middle East, even in South Asia, you know, as society becomes more open, as society becomes freer, hopefully, I mean, something that we all hope for, will there be sort of a loss in the power that words have in these kinds of societies? I don't know. I mean, it's something that I'm really curious to see, and something that I'll be monitoring. But what I do know is that the word has played a pivotal role in defining this region, in shaping it, and I think it's continuing to do so now in these movements that we are seeing.
That's interesting. That whereas when you're allowed to say absolutely anything, words lose their sting, and in America,
so, yeah,
where you can't say anything, they're less powerful in a way.
Yeah, I believe so. Okay, so this is the good part, where we open it up to discussions. Do we just pick people? And
I guess, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I was joking, but I mean, obviously, fiction has a larger audience. You know, very few people, at least in the West, read poetry. So. Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Well, I will say.
Sorry. Go on.
No, please.
I mean, conversely, for example, in Pakistan, you know, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who was very much the voice of the sort of the left-leaning anti-Bhutto sort of intelligentsia in the 70s. So there, I mean, I think in Pakistan, for example, it's been much more the poets.
In Iran too.
Yeah.
In Iran, I mean, yes, people read fiction, but it's poetry that matters, and poetry, not just contemporary poetry, but Hafez and Omar Khayyam and Rumi and even Ferdowsi, the great national poet who wrote the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, 1,000 years ago. The verses from these poets are part of everyday conversations in Iran. I mean, you can't have a conversation with the butcher without one of you bringing up Omar Khayyam. You can't get in a taxi without someone mentioning Rumi. It's just part of the identity of the Iranian people.
In another place where, interestingly, this has been true, I believe, is in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. I mean, for example, in Romania, where, what's her name? It'll come to me. And in Russia, where Akhmatova, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it does seem to be sort of regional. I'm not sure why.
We do have a microphone. We'd love to have the questions asked be recited in this microphone. It will be run to you. And here's our next question.
Hello, my name is John. I'd like to know what publications you would suggest for readers of English to understand the coded language that's being used in poetry in the various countries, and if that would include East Africa. Thank you.
It's yours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess this is, I mean, I'll just shamelessly plug myself. No, I mean, look, I put tablet and pen together. It took me 2 years to do this. It was a labor of love. I worked with an organization on whose board I serve called Words Without Borders. We translate literature, fiction, nonfiction, poetry from all around the world in every language you can imagine. We translate it into English and we post it on wordswithoutborders.org for free so that English speakers can become aware of the world's literature. But when it comes to the Middle East, these are titans of global literature who are completely unknown in the English-speaking world. And that's what I wanted to do, was to change that and to make it very accessible. So it's a collection from 1910 to 2010, translated from Arabic, Urdu, Persian, and Turkish, and put together in such a way so that it's very easy to understand, the connections that are being made in this kind of work. And by the way, tablet and pen is lifted from the title of an amazing poem by Fez Ahmed Fez, of all people.
Who has the microphone? I think that person can choose.
Yeah, I think you should just choose who the next person should be.
Hi. I saw an interview from Tahrir Square, several months ago, and the woman said, now that my face has been on TV, Mubarak has to go or we all go behind the sun. And I was just taken by that expression, had to write a poem about it. But my question is, if you know anything about the history of that expression, and since you're neither of you are Egyptian, maybe you don't, if you could share some of the kinds of common language that does inspire people or terrifies people that, is common in other places.
Do you know this
No,
expression,
I don't,
go behind the sun?
Maybe.
Mona?
Who's the Arabic people around here?
Yeah. Bilarabia, what is it in Arabic?
هروح ورا الشمس. Literally, I will go behind the sun.
Go behind the sun, yeah. But I mean, look, that's the kind of, that's the sort of coded language that we were talking about. So like when a Persian poet talks about, when someone like Farrukhzad, Farrukhzad, the great female Persian poet, really sometimes referred to as the Sylvia Plath of Iran, wrote in the 50s, died tragically, not with her head in an oven, but nevertheless died tragically at a very young age. When she writes about the wind-up doll, she has this amazing poem called The Wind-Up Doll, and it's all about this toy, this wind-up doll. But of course, it's a great metaphor for the role of women and the oppression that women, experienced in Iran and continue to experience today. That kind of coded language is one that the censors have a very difficult time with, that the authorities have a difficult time with, but which every reader knows what is being said. So if you're a journalist in Iran and you write an article condemning, the regime for the way that it treats women, you go behind the sun. If you're a poet and you write a poem about it, you're more likely to get away with it. Though you don't, it is often the case that you don't get away with it, but you're more likely to get away with it because of that.
Also, I think the poets and writers have satire at their disposal, which is, I think, in a way, the most effective way of undermining, autocrats.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and journalists don't have that.
Yeah. What do they say? The best way to defeat the devil is to mock him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
It works.
We have time for one more question.
Already? Wow, that was
fast.
Wait a second.
Hi.
Don't we have
I
an
had the
hour
great
together?
fortune of being in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon in January and December and January of this past year. And one of these seminal trains throughout all of the people that I encountered and had the chance of speaking to, there was a singer called Farouj, and she appeared to be singing folk songs about Pan-Arabism. And this would take into consideration an oral form of poetry with the lack of literacy, and it seemed to be a theme throughout the countries. Could you discuss that?
Yeah, these poems are meant to be heard, not read. The poem that I read by Nigam was sung, was put to music and actually sung. So that's a fairly common experience, and it's not just because, in some of these societies you're talking about, societies that are still very much steeped in oral culture, and oral traditions, but just because there is an understanding about these poems that they are meant to be. They're meant
absolutely.
to be. Yeah. You think of the Qawwal, or
Yeah, but in Pakistan you have the mushara. The poems. People are more likely to hear poems than to read them. I think they have these gatherings, which I've never been to one, but apparently even in the oddest places they have these gatherings to which a lot of people go. In small towns in Punjab, and these poets sit there and sort of recite in a very sort of theatrical way their poems, and people keep interrupting, and sort of it's a dramatic event.
Yeah.
Apologies for having misread the clock. We actually have 30 minutes left for questions.
That's what I thought. I was like, wow, that went really fast.
Yes.
I know we're fascinating.
We're traveling,
No,
time traveling.
we won't even get through 30 minutes.
So another
You
question,
guys are going to
please.
have time for coffee.
There was in the Nowruz, the Persian New Year address, President Obama quoted just a breathtaking passage by an Iranian poet who is in her 70s. Would you care to tell us a little bit about her? And
Who was it? Samin Behbahani? I don't
yes,
remember. It was Samin Behbahani.
Samin Behbahani.
Yeah, she is a remarkable poet. She's in fact, I've got a couple of her poems here, and maybe the best thing that I could do is just read one of these. But as a woman and as someone writing, in the late 1970s, as one of sort of the intellectual movers and shakers of the Iranian Revolution, which, by the way, was spurred by the intellectuals, by the intelligentsia. It was communists, it was Marxists, it was social democrats, it was lefties who got that revolution going. It's just it went over the finish line thanks to Khomeini, and that kind of changed the outcome of it, obviously. But unlike a lot of her fellow writers at that time, Samin Behbahani decided to stick around afterwards, and so I'm just going to read one little thing about this. This is her reason for staying, and she wrote this poem, as she says, "To those who left, to those who stayed behind," and the poem is called "You Leave, I'll Stay." You leave, I'll stay. You leave, I'll stay. I swear I cannot endure being separated from my homeland. Till my last day you will hear in my bone sill the same tale of the reed. Though sparkles and light may fill the nights of exile, they are of little use to me, since I am not happy in exile. From the agitation of fire and molten metal, the sky above me is as turbulent as my mind. When one must cover the light in a lamp, I would rather extinguish the flame than let my ears be pierced by the policeman's orders. Lights out, black out. Where will my heart escape if this house and its shade collapse on my head? In these dark ruins we remain, the children, the old people, and I, and our sad cares and thoughts of absent brave warriors. I will not forsake this unruly corner to beg for affection in a land of self-serving calculation. Even if this sky is dark and unsmiling, it belongs to me and my fellow countrymen. This canopy is not on loan. Hoping for a better day, I take one step, then another, towards something I believe. You leave, I'll stay. That's all I have to say about Samin Behbahani.
Hi there. I was wondering if either of you could speak to the task of translation and translating from Urdu or Persian or Arabic into English, and what the biggest challenges are, or what you think maybe the biggest losses in translating to English.
Really good question.
Huh? Well, I've translated from Urdu. Why don't you talk about Arabic, though?
Well, I have more luck translating from Persian. I do a little bit of translation from Arabic and none from Turkish. I've received an enormous amount of help from the people at Words Without Borders. And we have a kind of a rule there that, if we need someone to translate a work of, Russian poetry, what we get is a Russian-American poet. Because, obviously you need to have more than just the ability to transform words from one language to another. I will say the thing that's really complicated about a language like Arabic or Persian is that, for instance, in Persian, the verb in a sentence is always the last word in a sentence, which is why so much of Persian poetry comes in these rhyming couplets. And, I was talking about the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh. There are 60,000 couplets in that poem. Every one of them rhyme. That's kind of a little bit easier to do when the last word is a verb, and you can rhyme it in a lot easier. And when you translate that into English, it's almost impossible to get it to rhyme. So that's one of the major issues is the grammar. In Arabic, the verb is usually the first word in a sentence. So that, I think, is the real complexities with Persian and with Arabic. I know nothing about Urdu or Turkish.
Clearly there are some languages that are easier to translate into English than others. My impression is that, certainly my understanding is that the Urdu poets are much more difficult than many others.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because of the way in which one of the reasons is that the way the audience's relationship with certain what we think of as hackneyed images, somehow those images have a sort of a resonance within that culture and within the culture of those people who care about poetry. So in Urdu poetry there'd be sort of the nightingale and the beloved and the rose, and these are things that make Western audiences throw up. And so that stuff is very difficult to translate. And then also I think there are just some languages that are, for reasons that I don't understand, easier. I think, for example, Russian prose seems to be very easy to translate, just because one reads numerous translations of the great Russians, and all of them seem to more or less work.
It's funny too, because you bring up these words, because the same is true in Persian language, is that these words like the nightingale or the bridegroom or the rose petal or the cup of wine, things like that. Well, they're not just in the West, they're sort of hackneyed metaphors, but in the cultures of this region, they hark back to a poetic language that goes back more than 1,000 years, and these words all mean something. They're endowed with multiple layers of meaning if you're Pakistani or if you're Persian and you read them, and if someone says, fill the cup of my heart, with your wine, you know exactly what is being referenced there, all the different layers going all the way back to the great Sufi poets, etc. And you can see how it's being sort of turned on its head in interesting and unusual ways. But in English, it doesn't have that same resonance because we don't have the same relationship with it.
That's really interesting. I think that's, I mean, my father, who was born in 1906, so really was of was of a much earlier generation, and his father and his grandfather. I mean, these were guys who all could recite, Persian poetry for hours, so that there was a small, I mean, the number of people perhaps who cared about poetry and who understood poetry was not so great. But the ones who did do this stuff, and all of these, my father, when I started writing poetry, jokingly said to me, you'll be the 6th generation of our family who's written bad poetry. So that therefore, when you use, as you say, when you use those what we think of as hackneyed metaphors, the reader has this huge library of other beautiful poems to which are referenced, and therefore they work. That's really interesting.
Hi. I know about the role of poetry in fomenting revolution, but is there a role for literature in rebuilding a culture? The revolutions of the 18th century in the Western world brought about the end of the Ancien regime, and some of the writings of the philosophers created our Constitution and so on. But I wonder, when you talk about the revolutionary spring, you think we're tearing stuff down, but how will literature help us rebuild?
And rebuild it, yeah. Well, I mean, as I say, thank you for that. As I say, I mean, I think this is what remains to be seen. I will say this, though, is that when you look at, for instance, the Tunisian poet I mentioned, Abul Qassam al-Shabi, his very famous poem, To the Tyrant, became the rallying cry in Tunisia during the revolution there. But he also wrote a number of verses of the Tunisian national anthem. And although that national anthem was written very much, for an oppressive and authoritarian regime, what I thought was fascinating is the way that these kids actually began to sing the words of that national anthem, not because it just created this sort of solidarity, this idea that this is a national movement that is against a tyrant, not against the state itself, but also because in recognizing that the author of this national anthem, or at least a chunk of this national anthem, was the same author, who wrote To the Tyrant, which became the chant that these kids were using to bring down the Ali regime, in a sense indicates that perhaps there can be a role for rebuilding, for creating a different kind of national identity through the use of literature, through the use of poetry in particular. But I'll be honest, it's too early to know, and I'd be curious.
I mean, to follow on from that, I mean, it seems to me that in fact what literature always does and must do is to rebuild in the sense of building. I mean, it's painting and music and all the arts are what are so necessary for creating a sort of humane, intelligent culture. But I think one of the few rules that writers ignore at their peril is that their work must be affirmative. And I think anytime you have an art form which is infecting a large, or addressing a large large number of the citizens, that when it's that it is affirmative, that clearly is a part of building the society.
I will add one aspect to this. I mean, let's not forget that the regimes themselves also use poetry and literature to further their goals, to create a representation of themselves and of their rule.
Does that ever work? I mean,
no, it doesn't actually work. But I was thinking about, for instance, the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran, used to fill his court with poets, with court poets, who would, I know, it's like,
None of
where it's
whose
like the
works have
18th century.
ever been
yeah.
heard from again.
Precisely. And, you know, they would recite these poems to the Shah as, I mean, literally as he like walked by. They would just quickly show up and they would recite the poem as he was walking by, and then they would go back.
And they get a Mercedes.
And they would get a Mercedes in return. And those poems would, you know, if he liked them, they would be published, they would be taught in the schools, you know, children would have to memorize them, etc. And what was really funny to me is I remember this one instance, and I can't remember the poet, unfortunately, but there's this poet who wrote this refrain about the Shah, and the very famous line about it was that everywhere he steps, rose petals bloom. And in '79, there was a poet who changed the entire poem to...
Let's shame this person.
Yes.
Bad dog, where are you?
Don't move. In '79, during the revolution against the Shah, a poet changed that to say that everywhere he steps, a fart blooms. And so again, you know, they try to control, you know, that language, but it can't be controlled.
Yeah. Sorry, just to follow up on that. What's interesting is there seem to have been, you know, in periods such as in the Renaissance when, you know, these sycophancy worked somehow.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't seem to do in the modern age.
Hello. I was recently in Iran for 3 weeks, and it was really amazing. And I did happen to come across one of those little public poetry readings that you mentioned. We're in the tomb of Rotan, and this beautiful room filled with marble bas-relief sculptures, all about his escapades with the gods, all the way back to Xerxes. And it was wonderful. And this little old man started singing poems, and everyone stopped. All the school children, they gave him great respect, and everyone listened, and it was just a wonderful event. And
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes?
No, I was just going to say, it's really funny. I just had a very good friend of mine went to Iran for 2 or 3 weeks to travel, and he came back and he said, you know what's crazy about it is that, you know, when you, in America, all our heroes are like politicians and soldiers. If you go to DC, all the statues are politicians and soldiers. When you go to Iran, all the statues are poets. You know, it's Ferdowsi and Hafez and Khayyam, and, you know, I mean, Hafez's tomb in Shiraz, it's a religious pilgrimage site. It's remarkable. People come from hundreds of miles away just so they can touch the tomb, and they leave little bits of their own poetry, which I'm sure makes Hafez roll in his grave constantly. But it gives you an idea as to the sort of the majestic position that poets have in these cultures.
And also in Pakistan, there's a very strong tradition of these saints, and the saints play a very important role in the sort of in the culture. And the way in which these saints are venerated is for people to go to their shrines and play music. And so, you know, there's very much of a connection.
Very much so, yeah.
Between sort of religion and the arts.
And the Zoroastrians, that's the oldest religion in the world. That was very interesting. But
it's the oldest monotheistic religion in the world. Yes,
monotheistic. So I just wanted to mention an influence on the young people now. There are 60 million people living in Iran that are under 30 years old. And, you know, they just love Americans so much, and they have this very large influence now, which is our satellite television, and they seem to view America through the lens of Desperate Housewives and Grey's Anatomy, which is, and I must say, I was so impressed with their, they all spoke English perfectly, and some of them, it was very cute. They had Valley Girl accents with all the exact intonations, and when I just arrived there, I had went to visit the woman who owned the Contemporary Art Gallery. She had just gotten out of jail. She was caught up in the demonstrations. This was a year ago. And she only stayed in jail for 2 weeks, but all the students, she said, were all being raped and tortured, and they had to stay for 6 months. So I think it's they love Americans. People would run over to you and give you a green ribbon. And, you know, I went out on the streets every night with all the young people, and there's so much testosterone on energy. They're just breaking out, and they just want their freedom, and It was wonderful
No, I mean,
country.
you're
up there.
absolutely right.
Beautiful
I mean,
poetry all the way back to Xerxes. And
I think it's, I mean, look, when in Iran, you're talking about what is, I think, unquestionably the most pro-American population in the entire Middle East, and I'm including Israel in that. It's just, they love America, but they love American culture, they love American ideals, they love American television and American music. But it's also important to understand that a great part of their love for America is wrapped up in their hatred for their own country's leaders. And if their leaders tell them that America is the enemy, then by definition, America is the friend, as far as they're concerned.
You've pretty much limited your discussion of poetry as something to be recited, in some cultures to be read, although by only a relatively small group of people. But in our society, song lyrics are well, they're life-changing. The words to "We Shall Overcome" are nice, but when sung en masse, they really become impressive. Would you discuss the role of group singing, if it occurs in the Middle East, other than that one example of the anthem that you mentioned?
Well, I mean, the most famous example of this is the qawwali, the sort of devotional. I mean, it's sort of like a mass. Maybe you can.
Yeah, although I guess generally only the artists are singing, but certainly it's sort of a religious, and it's not a political event though, really. But I think that certainly in Pakistan we've had these females, like there's been Noor Jahan and a couple of other women whose songs were very important after partition in creating the Pakistani identity. So it was nationalistic rather than political in any left or right sense.
Yeah, and in Iran, there's a long tradition of traveling bards, and again, this goes back to way before the rise of Islam. And these bards, they will during Ashura or Muharram, which is sort of it's a Shia holiday. They'll go around from village to village, and they will sing songs about the great imams Hassan and Hussein, and there are bards who will sing songs, sing the verses of the Shahnameh, the Epic of Kings that I was referring to. It's still very much a public event, but music, for the most part, outside of South Asia, to be honest with you, tends to be frowned upon, particularly when it's in any kind of a devotional atmosphere. So, for instance, throughout the entire Muslim world, the recitation of the Quran, Quranic recitation, it's a public event. It's a sort of a concert. It's there are competitions, international competitions, where people will go up and recite the Quran, and an untrained ear would say, "Well, this sounds like singing, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it sounds like they're up there singing, but they are not. They have very, very strict rules about how long they can hold a consonant and how long they can hold a vowel, when they can stop for breath and when they can't, how close to a melody they can become without it becoming a melody." And again, outside of South Asia, this is just sort of, it's a part of the Islamic influence on particularly the Arab world. Not so much in Iran, but particularly the Arab world.
I guess the more Sufi you get, the more
that's the best way to put it.
I guess the other interesting instance of sort of a musicality that has a political importance is just the azan. The call to prayer. So I mean, in Lahore, where before the call to prayer was was very quiet. Now these guys have gotten into these competitions where they compete to buy the loudest loudspeaker, and during the time for the call to prayer, I mean, it's just incredibly, it's this cacophony, and some of them are very beautiful,
and some of them are awful,
and a lot of them are awful.
In fact, in Turkey, it's funny what they started doing in Turkey. to cut down on these awful calls to prayer, which are just unbearable and last forever, is that now they've sort of nationalized the entire system. So if you want to be a muezzin, someone who goes up and gives the azan, you have to actually be trained by the state. They train you in vocal characteristics and vocal training, and so that you have a beautiful voice and you do it well.
But it really does change. I mean, living at my farm, which is out in the countryside, before the only call to prayer I heard was the guy in the village, and it was soothing and sort of, was not at all oppressive. And now, first of all, there are all these more and more mosques have sprung up in the area, and each of them competes, and it really really is oppressive. I mean, the sense that, and it's the constant reminder that if you're not praying at the moment, you should be, and
yeah, especially when it starts at 4 a.m.
Exactly, that's when you.
What you've described is sort of passive. There's a lot of passivity. Somebody else is doing the singing, and your job is to listen.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But one would think that with Western influences, a Bob Dylan concert or a Bruce Springsteen concert or the Aspen Snowmass Jazz Festival would encourage audience participation with the passage of time.
I don't think Bob is very popular in these countries.
I think there's someone in the back.
Thank you, Reza and Daniel, for being here. You've really opened my mind. I just want to make sure that you know that there is a giant, very heavy statue of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in Portland, Maine. And it's very beautiful.
Yes, but it's not in D.C.
No, we tried to move it there. They wouldn't let us, but it is in Portland.
As a poet, I learn best other languages through translating poetry, and granted I'm imperfect in all other languages but English, but would that be something that you would promote, someone who wanted to learn modern Middle Eastern languages, varied though they are? Would translating poetry be an accurate way to learn the language, the symbolism of the language, that then you could take and actually turn into a conversation at some point?
Good question.
I suppose as an exercise it might be useful. I think to do translations that are really beautiful, it's better, you need to know the language into which you're translating perfectly. So, but as an exercise, I suppose it would be, I mean, certainly I find that translating from Urdu has improved my Urdu.
I mean, one thing that I think it would help with is that this is certainly true of Persian, it's certainly true of Arabic, I'm sure it's just as true as Urdu, is that there are so many, the vagaries of the language allow for multiple meanings, for words to have multiple meanings, sometimes contradictory meanings, depending on their context in which they're used. And so I would imagine that learning a language through that kind of process would allow for a greater understanding of those layers.
The other thing the thing that might be suggested that's not a good idea, with respect to Urdu at least, is that in Pakistan there are two sort of Urdus which are so dissimilar that often there's a demotic and then there's a sort of elevated Urdu, and the average guy in the street doesn't understand the demotic, and most of the poetry is written in the elevated language. So you'd start talking and people wouldn't know your vocabulary.
That's right. That's the one thing that we haven't talked about yet, is that in each one of these languages there are two versions of the language. There's the classical and there's the colloquial. The classical is what you hear in college. It's what the novels are written in for the most part. It's what the news broadcast is in, and colloquial is what everybody speaks. And especially with Arabic, this becomes kind of humorous. I mean, there's this totally invented language called Fusha, with modern standard Arabic, a total invention of the imagination, a way to make sure that all Arabs can understand each other, except that very few Arabs actually understand Fusha. And that's all you're ever taught, by the way. If you're an American who wants to study Arabic, that's what you're taught. And then, then you find yourself, in a cab in Marrakesh, sounding like an idiot. Forsooth, wilt thou take me to the nearest restaurant? what? You know, they look at you like you're crazy.
So maybe not.
Well, what happened to Persian when everybody started tweeting? How did the language change?
You know, someone needs to write a dissertation about this.
And they will.
Yeah, Persian, from what I understand, is one of the top 5 most common languages on the internet, which is shocking for a country of 75, 80 million people. But I'm curious about that. I'm really curious about that. For a long time, there was this really awful thing that was happening where Iranians were blogging, and this was before Twitter. They were blogging and they were, texting using Roman characters, but texting in Persian, which was just the most disturbing thing. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. But I don't know. That's a really good question. I think that's really a dissertation in waiting. If
Presumably
anybody
in
wants
America, when people do this, meet you, they use the simple language.
Yeah. Through the
yeah.
word THRU.
Exactly, all this sort of
How
stuff.
did that become?
But everybody seems to, at least writers and other people who are interested in language seem to think that this is leading to a dumbing down of the language. So presumably the result will be the same in.
I imagine, yeah.
In Iran.
Hello. We actually do now have time for one more question.
Daniel, thanks for your presentation. I wanted to add a few small things. About those Roman numerals, in Arabic at least, they often represent letters that don't exist in English. So it would be like ha and ayn and dad and things like that. But then they will use it, and it really does make you go cross-eyed. But I wanted to add something about music. It's not so much poetry, but it's hip-hop, which many can argue is modern poetry. Because in the run-up, over the past few years in the Middle East and North Africa especially, there has been a boom in hip-hop that has basically taken what hip-hop was originally meant to be when it was born in the Bronx, basically giving a voice to the voiceless, the disadvantaged, those who you normally don't see. And it was, especially in a country like Tunisia and Algeria, where French was the language of the upper classes, it was hip-hop, it was rap in Arabic that really spoke to towns like Sidi Bouzid and others that did not experience the privilege of Ben Ali and his cronies and all that money. And so you'll see rappers like El General, who was also being listened to, and he was imprisoned in the run-up to Ben Ali's being forced to step down. And when it comes to music, and I'm thinking especially of the man who asked about song, the Libyan poet Khaled Moutawa recently wrote a beautiful essay in the Daily Beast about the resurgence of Libyan song. And he says that when Gaddafi came to power, when he seized power, basically it was the day the music died. But now that they're fighting back, there's this wonderful rebirth of Libyan music, and there's this one beautiful song. People might have seen it on CNN when Ben Wiedemann got into Benghazi, but there was a huge, thousands of people outside the Benghazi courthouse all singing in unison this wonderful song called We Shall Remain, which really is the anthem of these revolutions and uprisings, because in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, there was a very popular song called Erhal, which means go, and so the people would say, you go and we stay, and in Libya it became We Shall Remain. So I think this is also where song and hip-hop, and basically that colloquialism that you rightly said, modern standard Arabic doesn't mean anything. Blogs and independent newspapers and hip-hop are using the language of the street because they represent the people, whereas modern standard Arabic are these dictators out of touch. So
it's hip-hop, punk rock, heavy metal. These genres of music are huge in the Middle East, and particularly in the underground in places like Iran. I think Mona said it best, but this was sort of anti-establishment music, right? I mean, punk rock used to mean something in this country before Green Day. Hip-hop used to mean something in this country before it was all about bling. And in this part of the world, it still does. And yes, some of the great American hip-hop acts like Mos Def, are huge over there, but the indigenous hip-hop, the indigenous heavy metal, the indigenous punk rock is phenomenal. It's better than 99% of the hip-hop, punk rock, and heavy metal being made in the United States. If you're interested in this, my website, Aslan Media, we have the video to El General, we have the video to Irhar, we have an entire section of music from this region by Persians, by Arabs, that show, the sort of the value that this kind of anti-establishment music has to the young people. You don't want to rap a little bit, little hip hop? No. Okay.
Our final question.
Daniyal, you mentioned illiteracy in Pakistan. Is it possible to be a writer in Pakistan?
Is it possible to be
a writer in Pakistan, making a living as a writer?
I'm sitting here. It's very difficult to be a writer writing in Urdu and make a living, certainly. But I mean, my audience is in the West. So in answer to your question, it would be difficult, I think.
And then in your book, you describe a society that is corrupt at every level. There's police brutality, there's political chicanery going on, tremendous differences between rich and poor. What's preventing a revolution from happening in Pakistan? What's the glue that holds the society?
Oh my God, that's such
that is a good question.
That'll take forever to answer that one. But I mean, I would have to take so long to answer that. I think partly it's because of the way that power is sort of not concentrated in any one place. There's a sort of there's the pretense of democracy, and governments do get replaced, and yet the real power lies with the ISI, who never really show their hand. So it's not really, when you have the Shah of Iran, it's very easy to know who you're going to kick out. I don't think anybody would know who to kick out. I mean, are you going to kick out this guy, or this guy, or this guy, or this guy, or this guy?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there was a popular movement in Pakistan to bring down a dictator. It happened a few years ago, with the lawyers' movement and everything that happened with Musharraf. But so what?
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
Nothing
happened.
It
never really gets traction.
Somebody else just stepped in and filled in those shoes.
I mean, that was just a sort of soft regime change.
Yeah.
But it was soft, and it just meant that the same establishment got sort of kicked out a new guy, and that's what happened. So there's that way of letting off the steam, but mostly I think it's because the power is diffuse, is in different places. Yeah, great, thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
That was great.